Hello and welcome to TaAF Talks, where we share what we're learning to help you create change and make a difference. My name is Jamie Ward, the Programme Manager for Together an Active Future. And you keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. I'll introduce you to Mr. Ken Matson. How you doing?
Am I a hero?
Not really, but you know I've been doing like the musical kind of quotes thing. I'm getting bored of that now.
Right.
So now I'm doing movie quotes, and each week I'm going to introduce you with a new movie quote,
Right.
and then you get to see and guess what it is. So I'll start with a toughie. Don't look at my notes, you little cheat.
I don't know.
Can you guess what that quote comes from?
No.
Okay, so that's from The Godfather Part 2. So there you
I've
go.
never seen either parts of The Godfather.
Well, there's 3 actually, but apparently I don't watch number 3. So yeah, look forward to that next one again next weekend when you go. I've no idea.
I don't know much about movies unless it's Disney.
Okay, well I'll try my hardest.
Yeah.
Let it go, Mr. Ken, that's it.
That's Frozen, that.
Okay, let's actually get into the podcast. So what we're talking about today, today will be the third in our series of 3. We've been talking about the TaAF model for change, and today is the third pillar, which is all about places. And so we've done behaviours and systems last time, so go and check that out maybe. And as always, we'll explain what we mean, what we're doing in this area, share some maybe examples, and hopefully direct you to some things that might be of interest if you're interested in place-based work. So Ken, perhaps if you wouldn't mind, so we've got places defined for us at least in our TaAF model for change. I thought maybe you could just read that out to give a sense of what it's about.
Yeah, absolutely. So for us, we've defined places as the environments in which people live play an important role in physical activity. We work to find ways to make it easier for people to know about and connect to existing opportunities to be active, and in some cases create new ones. That's tricky that. I've drunk loads of caffeinated drinks and I can barely see my screen.
And I think we've noticed that we might need to put a comma somewhere in that sentence.
That's where it tripped me up.
So thank you. So as we say, it's about places today. So, and the angle we're going to take is we're going to talk about how TaAF has more enabled place-based working to happen, rather than give examples or too many examples of just talking about the place-based stuff that's happening.
Yeah.
And that's mainly because, Pennine, Lancashire, big place, more than 500,000 people, 6 different districts. And so we've had to enable it, or we've wanted to enable it. And so I thought we'd get into that. So as always, Ken, a little back and forth. So why, firstly, did we go down this route? I think I've started to set it up there a little bit, but a bit more on that, please.
I think, start off by saying, I think that when we talk about our model for change, and we've discussed in parts 1 and parts 2 of this little mini-series within a series about behaviours and systems, it's kind of popular now to talk about place-based working and place-based approaches, and behaviours and systems that we've talked about in our model would form part of that kind of broader sense of what place-based working is. But when we talk about places, our context is really that we've been doing this work in Pennine, Lancashire, and Pennine, Lancashire is a combination of 6 local authorities, and in and of itself Pennine isn't a thing.
It's not real.
So we didn't even have a CCG that covered Pennine, because there was 2 CCGs, including Blackburn with Darwin. So it wasn't really a real footprint, but within that there are kind of 6 locality footprints. And the NHS, at the time we started the pilot, I'd looked at that as like a single footprint as well. And so we wanted to do work that was connected and collaborative across all of Pennine, Lancashire and East Lancashire as a kind of place in that context, but also to celebrate the diversity, the differences, the local themes and nuances within communities at a district and then even a micro community level. And for us, that when we talk about places, it's about the work we're doing in those smaller kind of almost geographical bits of the Together an Active Future footprint. So place-based working, I think, includes like systems and the behaviours, but when we talk about places in our model, we're talking really about geographical areas and places and local assets that people can connect to as an opportunity to be active, or find out more about, or that we can develop in order that they can support more people to be active.
Yeah, and I think if going back to the very early days, I think we've been written in one of our first submissions to Sport England is we knew we didn't want a core team sat on high making decisions about local places that we're so far removed from.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what's the best way of getting something far closer to local people that feels like they can own it, they're connected to it? And we'll talk in a second about how we kind of approach that. And maybe just to give a quick bit of context, kind of alluded to it there. So we've kind of got in Together in Active Future, we've got a coordination team who are trying to coordinate things and make it happen, and who also kind of have responsibility for the targeted elements of what we're doing, so working with some specific partners in specific places. We've got our universal network, which is some of our projects that go across multiple districts and across Pennine, Lancashire. And the majority of what we're talking about right now is the local networks, where we've actually created little mini TaAF teams in all of these 6 places, made up of people who are already embedded in those places, have a passion for those places, have great networks, relationships, connections, etc. And so I want to give some context to how it works.
Yeah, and I think what's really important, probably, just to build on those 2 points together. I mean, when Sport England started this work, what they were recognising was we don't know anything about Lancashire really, and I don't mean that with respect to everyone in Sport England who probably does know something about Lancashire. But I think there's this principle that the people who live and work there have a better feel for what's kind of happening and what some of the barriers and opportunities and challenges are within a place, and so we've got some of that across all of Pennine. But it was important then to continue that same approach of, us in Pennine, the coordination team, have a better feel for it than Sport England do in their central or regional offices. But then within Pennine, Lancashire, the Rossendale people and the Pendle people and the Hyndburn people know more about Hyndburn and Pendle and Rossendale than we would as we try and stretch across all. So it's that constantly trying to involve and empower the people who know best as to what's going to work for their place.
Yeah, it's a great point to kind of emphasise, isn't it? It's almost like you say, Sport England gave it to us, then we took it to the next level. And actually one of the things we'll talk about, our design principles, meant that even then we asked the Rossendale people to then take that to the next level again of how are you making sure you're involving people directly in those communities and streets. So we've started to touch on it a little bit, so maybe we'll talk about how at least we've approached enabling place-based work. So if I start with one of the ones, so we've probably talked on the podcast, in fact we definitely have in season 1 and probably alluded to it, we have this shared roles model where we've created these little mini TaAF teams, and the people kind of at the heart of those are people who are already working in those districts, already had great connections and relationships, already well established, had an enthusiasm for it. And so that was one way we thought would be a really great way of doing it. Invest in people in those places. They work a bit for TaAF, a bit for their host roles, but that means they're getting the benefit of TaAF and headspace and time and an exciting opportunity to do things differently, and TaAF's getting the benefit of great connections, relationships, passion for the place, a much deeper understanding of what's needed than we would have ever had.
It's one of our real kind of core how-tos. If we were to ever talk to other places about how you might go about this work, I think we would all sort of be in this default position of let's find people who exist within the places who can be brought into like a project team, rather than okay, so now let's advertise for some people to come and work here, because that synergy between existing role and shared role in terms of being part of a shared project team works really, really nicely. And then the second thing that we did, which I think was really useful at the start and has kind of been the way in which we've built our sort of insight-led approach to work, is we started to provide focus and information and themes to those more local teams in order to try and build, on the one hand, some science into it. So we provided data packs, insight, population data, health data, etc. But also then design principles and principles and ideas about how we want to work, in order that we can, in order that people were able to tailor their work to their place and local needs, but we could still keep some sense of connectedness and consistency across the whole of the pilot in terms of approach. And the reason that was important to us, and I think important to anyone who's doing this work, is it's within the tailored bits and the nuances that you find some real learning, but also with the consistency you get some applied learning across a larger footprint that means you can start to create some sort of ways of working and approaches and models. So by holding it together and by allowing some free-spiritedness, if you like,
Yeah,
and some
I like
creativity, the design principles really helped us to do that. And you, as author and mastermind of the design principles, perhaps not run through all of them, but give us a flavour of what that was designed for and how they've worked.
Yeah, I think I think you've started to allude to that. It really was about how do we get this balance of giving freedom to people, but because we know Sport England have invested us, and it has to be about doing things differently. It has to be learning from past mistakes. How can we ensure we don't just provide resources to a place and you can just do that any old time, but do so in a way that feels like it's definitely going to reach and do something differently.
Yeah.
And so what we did is we looked around a few of the other places that had almost like principles of working, and we stole a little bit, because that's what you should always do. Look to elsewhere about what other places have got. But as always, we tailored them to TaAF, and we just started to say, okay, ultimately, what should this be about? So knowing that the audience that Sport England specifically tasked us to do was people who aren't active, the ones who Sport England have really, really struggled to reach. And so the design principle number one, really simply, is be able to demonstrate that the work you're doing is ultimately going to make a difference to those people moving more.
Yeah.
It's a simple thing, but actually it's a good thing to come back to and test yourself against. And again, I won't go through them all because the danger is I was about to start doing 2, 3, 4 and 5, but there's other things in there of demonstrate how you're involving the people who are going to be a part of this, whether that's your local community or the residents or the people directly affected. Demonstrate how you're doing it. And our design principles all have that, and then they said, here's things to consider in how you could do that.
Yeah.
And even other stuff, one more is show how you're bringing together partners in collaboration to strengthen the capacity and the reach that you've got, as opposed to trying to do it in a kind of a team trying to do it all on their own.
Yeah, I think we've got there's just in terms of that how, just to give it a flavour of what that looks like. So in one of our locality networks, we've got a kind of a lead who's working for the Leisure Trust. But we've got a head teacher who's seconded, a GP who's in a shared role / seconded, someone from the local council, and they're all working 1 to 2 to 3 days a week in a project team. And so they've got all this different expertise. They know the place really, really well, but they're also layering then the learning that comes through the TaAF experience into those other organisations, and so you get that sort of ripple effect back out into the system. But they've designed like a design principles checker for whenever they're doing any projects or events, where they've got like a 9-box grid to match our 9 design principles, and they constantly talking about, well, how does that fit and lay together?
I don't think I knew that. It's a cool thing to hear. It's good to know that these things that, as you say, are architected, whatever the right word is, which it was a team effort, but definitely it's nice to know that they are actually being kind of used and applied. And I'll touch on one more, and then we can have maybe a bit of a break or something, I think. And ultimately for us, obviously, there's been an investment for Sport England, so it was important that you could create teams in the right places with the right passion and enthusiasm, but you've got to give these people resources. Now, resources, we can treat it as bluntly as funding, but give them a chance for some headspace, give them some time to really think about how to do things differently. Potentially give them resources that's connecting partners, or what can a council or a Resident Trust that you might work for help them do. Provide them with the resources to actually be able to get started with this stuff. And also, and this is the bit that is an ongoing interest. We'll come on to some of the challenges and realities later on, but the idea of giving them ownership of the plans being developed in their place. So we've got the guidance, we've got the principle, but what we're saying is, kind of down to you to work out what is needed based on good local knowledge, data, insight, and what you know and what people are saying. It's not down to us to do that.
No.
So we're creating, like, you've got your own mini version of TaAF with a few kind of guiding principles and structures.
I think, and the final thing that I'd say in terms of resources that I think is really important for people who might be thinking about doing similar sort of TaAF work but in their own places, there's a real value in having that sort of expert, quote unquote, sounding board. So all of those local, all of that local workforce and those shared roles teams have the likes of you, and dare I say it, me, to bounce ideas off, to that are spending a lot of time thinking, learning, and so we've got stuff that we can share. Podcast being one of them, but learning and experience, and so that having that sort of system change, mentor, coach place-based working expert, whatever you want to call it, is a really useful resource that we perhaps underestimate, but just having someone to guide and coach and mentor is really important as well. So,
sorry. No, I was going to say, and actually I think we could only touch on a little bit of how this place-based approaches work today. And so in reality, I think if it's something that you're super interested in, we might share a few resources later that happens, but actually there's probably just something in, feel free to get in touch and have a conversation, because it's very nuanced and all manner of stuff involved.
So as usual, middle of the podcast, just going to share with you listeners just a little activity that you could do around the theme of places.
Okay.
And again, one of the things that we think is really important is this idea of connecting and breaking down sort of the professional layer and starting to get to know people on more of a personal level as well. And so the activity we're going to do today is just to, what you would do is invite people around the room on the table just to share, thinking back a time or particularly a place where they have been active and what that was like in the past. And so I'm going to ask you, Jamie, a bit of nostalgia. In a time in your life where you've been active, just tell us about what that place was and what it was like.
Okay, so I like it when Ken does these and I don't have enough warning and prep for it. So if you remember last week, where week before, I can't remember, we did the life course tool and I did it. And what I said, and so it's real what I do, is that I hadn't been active from the age of about 10 through to 40. So my nostalgia has to go way back, do you know what I mean, of when I was active.
So far back you could make it up.
It's not my style though. So actually I think, interestingly, well, it might not be interesting, but my place was almost literally on the street out of my back door. Do you know what I mean? And I think, when I think about that, what's interesting is you walked out and we had a little grass patch that was part of the church grounds that we used to just go on there and just chuck a rugby ball and American football around. You had literally the curbs outside because we used to love a game of Kirby. Do you know what I mean? You had the back alley where you used to bomb down on bike races and stuff like that. And all of this is within 100, 200 yards. And then even just the woods a little bit further away for like games and manhunt and stuff like that. And what I think is interesting about that is I imagine that would never happen at all anymore like that. Do you know what I mean? Whether or not it's, you wouldn't be allowed to just play on the church grounds anymore because people are a little bit kind of fussy about that kind of thing now, and back then we didn't care. Or you just don't tend to see people outside playing Kirby and being on the streets and annoying car drivers and stuff anymore. Do you know what I mean? It's and so where do you just go out to just get out of the house and be active?
Yeah.
So that was my nostalgia. It was playing out literally out the back door within screaming distance of my mum for tea. And then, just there in that space.
Yeah. And so we'd encourage you to think about, when you think about places to be active, we tend to think, perhaps default these days, like formal settings, sports centres, playing fields and whatnot. But we're doing some work around active environments, and there's a little project in one of our districts called Back to Grass, where they were just trying to open up spaces of grass like a church field and others to say community, just like use this bit of grass and don't worry if it's a bit wet or it's a bit muddy. That's mud is good for children. Mud is good for children to kind of have on their hands and on their knees and whatnot. And so there's something about places which, it's that whole context from sort of active environments to streets to open grass spaces, right the way through to formal settings like sports clubs and playing fields and leisure centres and swimming pools. But don't be creative in what that means. Yeah. So what does a place mean, and how can that be a resource within a physical activity landscape? Because similarly to you, just played out. Yeah. We were just saying before we started recording the podcast that I've got 2 girls and 3 boys in my family. And I can't remember a time when they've ever played out, and when I've challenged them to just like go and play out, they're like, Dad, I don't know what you mean.
What you want to bet?
What do you mean play out? So they'd walk like 2 miles to the local park. And I'm like,
but I suppose when you describe it, it's hard to make it sound like a cool thing. Just go out and just do stuff. It's like, I don't know what you mean.
Yeah, it's weird. It's weird. Anyway, so one way that you can add an extra layer to that activity if you've got a particularly enthusiastic team is get them to draw their place first and see if you can kind of guess or articulate a bit of Pictionary to see, what's the place that you remember playing in.
I like that. Anytime you can connect a better thing from the past and stuff, it gets people talking and smiling and stuff, then it's great. Okay, Bill, thank you. I like these trips down memory lane. I always get quite kind of emotional thinking back. We need to stop getting things that get me emotional on the podcast, please. So I thought what we'd talk about is, we've talked a little bit around the context and how we've done it, why we did it and how we did it. So maybe now just talk about some of the realities for us of, it's easy to think, oh, this sounds like TaAF's absolutely nailing this stuff and it's all perfect. So maybe let's just share some of the realities of when you enable place-based working in the way we described. Things you just got to be aware of, things you got to know about, things you got to manage.
Yeah, so, I'll start off with one. I think one of the things that's tricky is this sense of balance between providing good structure and resources and principles for people to work to, and then, giving people the space for creativity. One of the things we talk about is sort of process and policies where creativity goes to die. And so that's a balance, because I think it's important, without some sort of structure and guidance and some principles to follow, particularly for people who might be starting to try to do things differently. It's really easy and almost inevitable. You just default back to what you've spent your whole career doing. So those bits of guidance and structure sort of continue to almost force people to step into the unknown and do things differently. And I think that's really important, because otherwise it's almost impossible to do off sort of your own natural get up and go. But then you don't want to stifle that creativity of people sitting in a place.
And I think always wanting to be open and honest is, we've almost iterating this as we go. Yeah. Every now and again, some of the teams will go, we actually want you to give us a bit more direction on this particular thing. Do you know what I mean? And we're always like, I want to be hands off, and actually sometimes that it almost requires them to go, no, this is one of those occasions you need to put something in place and give it to us, because that's miles more helpful then for us to know exactly what we need to do in our freedom element of that.
Yeah.
So it is definitely iterative. I'll talk about this one because it's one that somebody like me who struggles to let go of stuff, and
control freak
is a slightly less nice phrase for it. Yes. What we've ultimately created is people delivering their own version of TaAF in their places, which is absolutely the intention. But what it inevitably means is that the TaAF that I'll sometimes describe to people, which will be the TaAF that I kind of live, based on the stuff that we've kind of done, might be different to how one of the district's version of TaAF. And that's not wrong. It's still within design principles, it's still looking at the look, the sound, the feel, it's still doing great stuff. But it's just an interesting thing for me to kind of recognise that actually that version of TaAF is different and it's doing great stuff by all accounts. And so just embrace the fact that it's a different version of TaAF to the one that I might describe in my own mind as idealistic. But that's because there's no such thing as an ideal TaAF. What I mean is my version of it.
Yeah. If place-based work and a system changes like music, we all like different bands, right? And so you can acknowledge that music is the thing that we need, but we're all going to like slightly different music, or and that's the same actually, not only within the team, but all of the people that live within the place, that really broad network of partners and communities. But I suppose what we're saying is, there's some principles of what music is.
Yeah.
But write your own tune, so to speak.
Absolutely. I gave you all a guitar. Why aren't you playing Oasis?
Yeah.
I don't understand it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah.
We don't need to, Jamie, because you're playing Oasis. We've got our own band over here in Burnley that we love, or in Hyman that we love. Yeah,
absolutely.
I like that music analogy.
So another thing that's really difficult. So we would absolutely advocate for this idea of shared roles, people in the system coming together to collaborate on a system-wide place-based approach, and people who really then know the place, but it's hard to balance.
Yeah.
So it's hard to balance your existing work and new work, and there's loads of benefits to that, but it's worth noting that's hard to balance. And then we've developed something called like a shared role. What's it called? Our shared role.
Responsibilities or expectations. I can't remember what it's called at the moment. Yeah.
So that kind of outline, because it's not just the person, it's their host organisation, it's the kind of project team. Everyone's got either like a clear sense of and commitment to what it means to kind of be giving time towards a shared role project team. So that balance is tricky, but there are ways to make it easier.
And maybe one last one, I think, and you'll know more than this, to be honest, because I ignore this world of sometimes some of the local politics of stuff.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? There's probably external pressures that come in, particularly if there's some resources attached to a thing. You might have local partners, or dare we even say local elected members, who feel like they've got a better idea about how this money should be used. And sometimes there'll probably be an element that I don't even see of our TaAF teams having to hold their nerve or kind of push back a little bit on where people think things should be going.
Yeah. So place-based working, this kind of systemic approach takes a long time. So we've been working on Together Active Future for 5 years.
Yeah, pretty much getting there now.
Getting there. And we're looking ahead for another 5 years. And so across that time, whatever resources you have got, through that kind of political shifting sands, every now and then people do come and be like, well, hang on a minute, you've got X thousand pounds for Together Active Future, like I really need 50 grand to go towards a new running track.
Yeah, let's budget, that's physical activity,
Yeah,
let's do that.
Let's have it. So I think there is something around being really clear about what the principles are, what is the resources for, and what we're trying to accomplish, and have that kind of inner form.
Yeah.
So the design principles provide that for us. That's really clear. So when you're getting those challenges or those political pressures or whatever to shift, you need to be able to shift and move, but you also need to protect yourself to kind of know what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Yeah, and I think coming back to one of your early points of that's where having almost like a coordination team and people like us, who you can almost say, we're doing it this way because this is the way TaAF is kind of setting it out. Do you know what I mean? It's almost like we've got your back. Yeah. So you can use us to deflect any of this attention sometimes, and we'll happily do that. Yeah,
deflect, blame, get support.
Yeah, blame's good.
Ken won't let me, so I can't.
Yeah.
And the reality is that would never really be true.
No, Ken says yes to everything.
Spending money. Push Ken. But you can use that sort of friendly, experty team, and Sport England have been super good at that in terms of, well, what do you want to do? Okay, well, we'll help you stand your ground on that then.
Absolutely.
So that's been really valuable.
Perfect.
Should we give a few quick examples of some of the sort of placey based pieces of work we've done and then wrap up?
Yeah, that sounds good. Placey base. Going up with some nice rhyming things today, I like it.
Too much caffeine, you see.
Ken did 2 litres of Pepsi Max in one go before we started.
In about 10 minutes.
So I think there's one place in Blackburn with Darwin called Witton Park, and again, won't go into specific what that example is, but what it was is a really great example of a local person we have a shared role in Blackburn with Darwin, somebody who kind of understands the area really well, who had a really great relationship with local partners in that area. And so when a local partner had an idea, which was a sound and a strong idea, the TaAF member of the team knew to go, that sounds great, how about connecting these other 2 partners, because they've been exploring something in this area, and I think there's something really great we could all do together. Do you know what I mean? And this idea of, we wouldn't have known that network of partners who could potentially be involved, and she was also in her role chatting to them for different reasons. And so what that did is that brought partners together that turned one idea now into a multi-partner project that's looking really cool and really promising and doing great stuff. And relating it back to the design principles, principle number 6 we have, which is about demonstrating how you're building capacity and strength through partnership and collaboration. That's a perfect example of it.
And it's in a local park, in a council where this project is kind of coming together, and so that's something relatable, I guess, to many people potentially listening to this podcast. But it's not about a council developing a master plan and then funding it and delivering stuff in the park. It was about, like you say, all these different partners had aspirations to do work, and the bringing together, the moulding, the shaping, using their expertise about, well, it won't work if we do it that way, but if we do it this way, it can be really valuable.
How can we enable it? Yeah. By connecting you, by facilitating a chat.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Ironing out minor disagreements from every now and then, and so it's all
a little bit of resource where it's needed, but in the right way, in a way that we can see is going to lead to something sustainable.
Yeah. Another example would be in Burnley. They're developing this idea of the outdoor town, and they utilised an off-the-shelf product called Beat the Streets, which is almost like a gamification of local streets where you can kind of build points by moving around, walking, jogging, cycling, whatever it might be. But working with the team from Beat the Streets as well, they have taken that and then tailored it to their local place. And what was really interesting about that is when they first wanted to work with the Beat the Streets team, we as a coordination team were a bit resistant and reluctant of that feels a bit programming, a bit intervention. You're just going to do a thing. Yeah. How is that different? How is that system working? But but the way in which they've used that then to, well, first of all, they knew better because they knew their place and they knew their network and their partnerships. So that was really important, but they've used that as a catalyst. So it wasn't about getting people moving around the streets only, but it was about drawing partners in, fostering the network, a catalyst for emerging work moving forward.
Energy, enthusiasm, connections,
and gaining loads of insight from partners and members of the public about what was working for them. They understood a bit more where do people walk and when and what times a day, and also loads of insight in that as well. And so that's been really owned by local people. And interestingly, in this, contrary to the initial default position of the experts, if you like, but they fought for it because they understood what would work in their place.
100%. And again, coming back to design principles, because we're probably going to direct people to them at the end of this podcast, is we've got one, involve local people in gaining insight and finding solutions, and that's a perfect example of doing that. And actually, one of them also talks about demonstrate how you are taking something that can be different and how you can do that. And they took a thing that they knew they could use in a different way to really reach something, which was fab. And maybe we'll touch on one more really quickly, and I think this is not necessarily connected to a design principle, but again something about that place-based working of, we've got a team called Create Football, who were in a particular place, and really these are guys who provide social football for people who are generally a little bit down or struggling with mental health, anxiety, etc. And that was just an example of finding people in a place who've got a passion for the thing that they do, but then backing them to be able to grow and expand that into other places. That was an example of something that was already working great in one place. Well, how can we really support you guys to maybe expand that into another place based on really good, because they almost have their innate inbuilt design principles already. It's always about local people getting involved. It's always about people who volunteers who run it. It is already naturally owned, really sustainable immediately. So they're a great example of that. The local passion, enthusiasm, people who know best making it happen. Yeah,
and they as we've helped them to now work with new places. That's what they've done. They've worked with and in new places. Yeah. So worked with other partners and organisations to take their learning approach and support it and merge it and integrate it with others.
Sorry, just to interrupt on this, man. The first thing they do when we were talking about potentially expand it, they go and speak to a couple of local pubs, see if anyone's interested in sponsoring. They go and speak to some local partners who are already interested in that kind of thing to see who's already on board, who's local, that we can just kind of support and help, versus how can we come in and do our thing in your place.
Yeah. Cool, so there's a few examples. And there's many more, and so if you want to understand anything more about the work that we're doing in places, we can definitely connect you in with our teams who are doing that. So if people wanted to learn a bit more about working in places, or some of the work that we've done specifically, where should they look?
Well, the easy ones we've referenced it about 15 times already. So on our TaAF website, we've got a tab that says resources. I forgot to say the word resources then from this, why I paused. Resources. Anyway, it really doesn't matter. And on there, we've got our design principles. Now, our design principles, as they are, I think were perfect for getting started. So, if you're setting off into place-based approaches and you're trying to get something happening, I think they're a pretty decent resource. Normally we talk about go somewhere else and get something. In this case, I think the ones we've got there, everything we've got is editable and adaptable. You can download it as PowerPoint. Because you might just say, actually, we only need a few of those, but they're really great. And so I think actually it's a strong start, that, because I think they have really helped our teams understand what it was we were trying to do and feel like they could own it by having something to refer back to and test themselves against.
Yeah, absolutely. We mentioned as well the shared roles and responsibilities document chart. We'll put in the information on the links for this exactly what the name of that is.
I wrote it, I can't remember.
It's on the TaAF website under resources as well.
I'm not sure it is actually, but it will be
in about an hour from now.
It will definitely be as a link in the show notes. Yeah. But again, and as Ken said, described, that's almost setting out the expectations of everybody within that kind of shared role model, because that has been a big deal for us in how place-based has really been beneficial and really meant to happen. There's a couple of other, the look, the sound, the feel is not necessarily place-based, but I just like directing people to it because it's still around, doing things in a style that connects with people, creating the environment that works for the people in that place, rather than coming in with your lanyards and your language and all this stuff, which is guaranteed to put people off.
Okay.
And then one thing, because I was mindful, I didn't want to just direct people to TaAF stuff. Do you know what I mean? Because apparently there's other stuff out there. So one, and I didn't have any definite go-tos, but I had a little bit of research, and I found something that, and I normally pick stuff that connects with me because it's simple but seems clear. And so the National Lottery Community Fund have a document, and again, we'll link this in the notes. Now the name, actually, I don't think is particularly helpful if they want to direct people to this, because it's called Putting Good Ingredients in the Mix. So that's not necessarily the best name ever for what this is. But ultimately, it was a little bit of helpful guides for people who are interested in place-based work, particularly funders. And it's just got some pages 5 to 10, really simple. It breaks down, here's some things to think about. So section number 1, I won't go through all of these, but know the history and the context of the place. And then there's usually just a few bullet points to give you suggestions of. So maybe don't lead with the money. Spend some time getting to know the area and doing a bit of recon. You know what I mean? Base yourself in that place. So in our case, have a team who are already based in that place, because local people probably don't trust people who come in from the outside, dare we say. So there's a few sections, and again, I've got to stop myself doing this. I thought some of them were really good. There's like talking about investing in the people and the relationships, building a shared vision for change, and some of this, just give power to local people is massive. Work on what's possible and what they've already got in that place, and you've mentioned before about the asset-based community development. It's all that kind of stuff. And so there's just really easy things, I like this one. Start small and try some different stuff. Don't come in with what could work and don't work. Don't preconceive that idea. Just come in and go. So
looks really good.
It is really simple. I'll direct people to that. It's got the usual references that show it's research-based and all the stuff that gives you confidence this is based on something decent. But you could almost see it as an interesting little guide and a checklist that you could work through, not dissimilar to what we think our design principles are a little bit.
Cool.
So I thought that might be interesting. We'll link that in the notes.
I think it's time for a wrap-up.
Okay then. So we've shared some things to direct to there, and maybe we just share back maybe one thing that we've discussed or thought about today that we just want to kind of remind people of or kind of finish on, if you like.
So what final thought for me, or something to mind of, don't underestimate the value of a mentor, a coach, a sounding board, an expert can be really valuable as you set off. And I think many of those are across the country and around the world, but the local delivery pilot team's not a bad place to start.
Yeah, and one on mine is, it's a little bit at the moment our experiment, but just think a little bit differently about your approach to teams or capacity in places. Think really close, as you said about Sporting England before, how close can we get capacity in people into that place we're trying to make a difference? And how do we think differently about the team structure we might think about to do that? I think it's a perfect thing to start. Don't default, what can we get that's super close? So that was a nice, long, kind of messy one, but there you go.
It was still one thing.
One thing, we're getting better at this, aren't we? Okay, so that's it from us. So thank you so much as always for listening. As we're now directing you to do, if you've enjoyed this, or even if you haven't, share it anyway to your enemies as well as your friends. So thank you so much. We'll be back again soon, so look out for that. Until then, cheerio.
See you soon.